tonight is Jessica Whitehead. She is the Nancy B. Resch Curator of Arts and Cultural Partnerships. Well, that's a mouthful. At the Filson Historical Society. She is author of the recently biography of the artist, writer, and sustainability pioneer Harlan Hubbard, titled Driftwood, The Life of Harlan Hubbard, as well as The History of the Kentucky Derby in 75 Objects, penned for the Kentucky Derby Museum in her previous position as their Senior Curator of Collections. She wrote an article in the April edition of the Kentucky Monthly. I don't know if any of you get this, but she wrote a fantastic article in here about women taking the reins of horse racing. And what she did, she showed in this article how difficult it was for women to become jockeys in the horse racing industry. And it's an extremely good article that she wrote. Anyway, in addition to this and other books she's written, Jessica was a founding board member of the nonprofit organization Payne Hollow on the Ohio, where she still serves as a historical consultant and manages its collections of artifacts. In her spare time, Jessica also enjoys art, gardening with her partner Phil, and reading books with her large cat Bean. She lives in New Albany, Indiana. Please welcome Jessica Whitehead.
Well, thank you all for having me here. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Okay, excellent. I'm thrilled to be back in Northern Kentucky. Some of you may have been to previous presentations that I've done in Kenton County and Campbell counties, or you may have gone to the Behringer-Crawford Museum a few months ago when the exhibit that was based on this book was there at the Behringer-Crawford Museum, and you could really explore the paintings and artifacts related to Harlan and Anna's life. That exhibit, by the way, is still for another week in Maysville at the Kentucky Gateway Museum there in Maysville, Kentucky. So if you have some time the next week and you really are just burning to see some Harlan Hubbard paintings, that's a great place where you can go and see those. After that, I'm literally going to be driving that exhibit from Maysville to Paducah, where it will be living until August. So there are still some opportunities to see that exhibit if you'd like to. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is just giving you a little taste of what's a really big story, right? So how many of you are already familiar with Harlan and Anna Hubbard? Okay, yeah, so you know how big this story is, how many incredible acts Harlan and Anna Hubbard had within their lives, and how many incredible things they did in each of those acts. So I want you to think of this as a little taste of a much bigger meal that you can have in the book if you desire, or you can have in going to see those exhibits. I was never fortunate enough to meet Harlan or Anna. So both of them had passed away by the time I was born. I was born in 1989. Harlan died in 1988, and Anna died in 1986. So everything that I have come to know about the Hubbards is from people who did know the Hubbards. Lots of interviews and conversations with people who knew them personally, but also through the incredible boon of artifacts left behind by the Hubbards that we can study. So, of course, wonderful paintings done by Harlan, but also their huge amount of correspondence that is cataloged at the University of Louisville Archives and Special Collections. If you're ever itching to get your hands on reading some Hubbard artifacts, that's a great place to do it. The Behringer-Crawford has an incredible collection also of primary source material related to the Hubbards. And there are also, of course, structures still standing. Many of you may be familiar with the Fort Thomas studio of Harlan Hubbard that he built in the 1930s, which we'll talk about. That is run by the Fort Thomas Forest Conservancy, and they do open studios every couple months where you can go and visit the property. And there are actually 3 Hubbard structures on that property. So it's a really, really cool place to see some of those early works that Harlan Hubbard was doing in this 3-dimensional, large-scale media of architecture. But, of course, his best-known structure is at Payne Hollow. And Payne Hollow in Trimble County, Kentucky, we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about the preservation efforts that are happening right now with the new nonprofit organization, Payne Hollow on the Ohio, to make sure that those structures are preserved for future generations. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But just out of curiosity, who's been to Payne Hollow? Who's here? Awesome. And who's read Harlan Hubbard's books, either Shanty Boat or Payne Hollow? Awesome. Who's read Driftwood, by the way? Oh, look at you guys. So, in any case, I just wanted to sort of introduce you to what made me fall in love with Harlan Hubbard and then eventually with Anna. I was an art history major at Hanover College, so beautiful Hanover College. If you've been to that campus, you're very familiar with this wonderful view from their point. The point looks down on those wonderful bends of the river toward Kentucky and Trimble County. And this painting used to hang behind the circulation desk at Hanover's library. And you can probably tell, since I'm an author, I was a pretty bookish gal in college, so I was in the library a lot. I also worked in their archives. And so I saw this painting a lot, long before I ever knew who this person was who had signed in red paint down at the bottom, Harlan Hubbard. Felt drawn in by this painting. We'll come back to this painting at the end because it has sort of a poetic resonance to me later on in this story as well. But this is how I first fell in love with Harlan, was through his art. And then I discovered Harlan's writing, which introduced me to Anna and this beautiful voice, poetic voice that Harlan had in telling stories about their adventures. And through that, of course, I discovered this life, this beautiful life that was, the pinnacle of the Hubbard legacy that they built together eventually at Payne Hollow in this amazing homage to simplification, to sustainability, and to the memory of Henry David Thoreau and the Transcendentalists. So we're going to talk about all that, but just one thing I love to point out is why this book is called Driftwood. What you're looking at here on the screen, this is the original first page of the typed manuscript for Harlan Hubbard's breakout book, Shanty Boat. Shanty Boat wasn't always called Shanty Boat. In fact, Harlan Hubbard wanted it to be called Driftwood because he uses the idea of driftwood as this incredible metaphor all throughout Shanty Boat, but frankly, all throughout his journals, all throughout his life. The idea of driftwood is something that maybe is useless, drops off of a tree, a dead tree limb, drops into the river and is carried and shaped and transformed into something incredibly different, incredibly beautiful, incredibly unique, incredibly strange. And it's sort of a metaphor for how he saw his life unfolding over the many, many years and his many, many acts. But let's go back to the beginning. We're here in northern Kentucky, so we're going to talk a lot about northern Kentucky here for a second. Harlan Hubbard was born on January 4th, 1900 in Bellevue, and many of you will be very familiar with Bellevue. Bellevue was an incredible place, but a very different place when Harlan Hubbard was born in 1900. And incidentally, we're all history nerds here. How great is it when somebody's born in 1900? Ooh, you never have to do math ever in your life. I love that. But on the screen here, you're seeing Harlan Hubbard's parents. This is Frank Gilbert Hubbard and Rose Ann Swingle. They both look a little dour, a little grumpy here, but this pair met actually in Champaign, Illinois, where both of them were working in the 1890s. Rose, unusual for a woman in the 1890s to be a very, very open, happy working woman. Rose was working as a typesetter for the Champaign Daily Gazette. She sort of harbored ambitions to eventually become a writer herself. That never materialized, and that caused some of the problems that she would have in the future, which we'll talk about. Frank was sort of this rambling man. Frank, he was a hobbyist, he was a tinkerer, he was a creative soul who loved to play with ideas, but had a lot of sort of half-baked inventions that never really made their way into fruition. Frank was also someone who didn't really care about monetary gain. He didn't really care about societal progress. He didn't really care about climbing the ranks of society in Fort Thomas or in Bellevue or in Cincinnati. He just was happy to, play with his inventions, make a little bit of money, and support his family. Rose was not like that. Rose was very interested in monetary gain. Rose was very interested in ambition and in being tied into the social aspects of life in northern Kentucky and in southern Ohio. And so they sort of clashed. It's not really clear why they ended up getting married. Harlan never went so far as to say that his parents' marriage was unhappy, but there was tension there. And he always liked to explore the tensions he felt in himself and the tensions he felt in his brothers, who we're going to talk about in a moment, in terms of his parents' surnames. So there was on one side of the continuum the Hubbard-like people in their family, and on the other side of the continuum there were the Swingle-like people in their family. And those two families, ne'er the twain, met very often. But this is a very interesting family dynamic that had produced 3 sons, very handsome sons, as you see. So these are Rose and Frank's 3 sons. These were all taken around 1904. So Harlan Hubbard is 4 years old. You can tell how much older his brothers were. Rose had a few, we think, miscarriages in between the middle brother and Harlan, which accounts for this difference. But there was about a 10-year age gap between the eldest Hubbard brothers and Harlan. And what this meant is that Harlan really looked to his elder brothers as sort of pseudo-father figures, especially because in 1907, their father would pass away. And we'll talk about that in a second. But the eldest is named Frank, after their father. The middle brother is Lucian. He went by Louis. And then, of course, you have sweet little Harlan here. And another sort of impact of having these elder brothers that he was sort of tagging along after when he was young was that their interests became his interests. So, of course, a major interest that most self-respecting young kids who live along the Ohio River eventually develop, which is being on the Ohio River, in the Ohio River, boating, fishing, swimming, all kinds of things that deal with the recreation on this incredible waterway. And so all of them love to camp together, they love to fish together, they love to build boats together. You see that top picture there says Our Canoe. That's a canoe that Harlan watched his elder brothers actually build. So early experience watching someone build a boat, which of course would become an important part of Harlan's story. But in addition to this experience of exploring the river, of loving the river, and of loving this landscape, northern Kentucky landscape, Harlan also took the other interests of his brothers. The eldest brother, Frank, was an artist. He wanted to become an artist. And he had already studied at the Ohio Mechanics Institute in Cincinnati to become a technical illustrator. And so he was colorblind, as a matter of fact. So most of the work he did was in black and white and grayscale, which was perfect for illustration. But Harlan learned many of his first art techniques from his elder brother, Frank. The middle brother, Louis, wanted to be a writer. So it makes sense that Harlan eventually would spend so much time with these brothers in his formative years and ultimately end up taking on these dreams too, of being an artist and being a writer. I mentioned that Frank was really Harlan's first art instructor. This is one of my favorite pieces that is in the book and that I found in my research. And it's this wonderful drawing done by Harlan's eldest brother, Frank, of Harlan when he's 7 years old, learning to sketch. It's a wonderful example of how early Harlan Hubbard was learning from his brother and learning the techniques of draftsmanship, which would be an underpinning of all of his artistic success later on. He was a very skilled draftsman. And this is another piece of Frank Hubbard's here, a sketch from the riverbank here in northern Kentucky. But I mentioned that their father, Frank Gilbert Hubbard, passed away in 1907. And this was formative, especially to Harlan's elder brothers. And we'll talk about that in a moment, why this had such a huge impact on them. Harlan, of course, was pretty young. He was only 7 when his father died. So he had most of his impressions of his father were that impressions, or they were stories from his brothers and from his mother. But he really identified, or chose to identify, with his father and this sort of Hubbard-esque nature that his father displayed that was so different from his mother and that Swingle-esque nature that she displayed. And he writes this incredible barn burner of a quote here in the 1970s when he's thinking back about his father. And he says, "If our father were living today, he could be more true to himself and suffer less in spirit. Public opinion has become more lenient to the Hubbard temperament. The importance of worldly success, the struggle for ever higher standards of living, the ideas of progress and increasing bigness of man's domination over nature, once as unquestioned as the Bible, are all becoming suspect now that the environmental disaster brought about by a rash and selfish application of technology is realized. No one that I know has chosen to give away his worldly goods, but there is a new incentive to do so, and an added honor and integrity to voluntary poverty." What a quote. Isn't that wonderful? And you can see, as he's writing this, how much when he was writing about his father, he was also writing about himself. You can see that identification. But of course, Frank Sr.'s death had the biggest impact at that particular time in the late 19aughts and the early 19-teens on Frank and Louis, the eldest brothers, because they suddenly became the caretakers of their youngest brother and their mother. Fortunately, they were both doing really well in their chosen career paths. So Frank, I had already mentioned, had attended the Ohio Mechanics Institute in Cincinnati, and so he was getting work doing illustration for local newspapers. He was even working on some publications, doing illustration, and then also doing some mechanical drawing. Louis, I mentioned, wanted to be a writer, and he had become a pretty sought-after journalist. So he was sort of an itinerant journalist. He would write for papers in Chicago. He covered a huge election in 1910 in Chicago that's really interesting to read about. He also would work down in New Orleans and San Antonio, and of course in Cincinnati and northern Kentucky. And he was gaining a lot of important bylines that got attention of none other than the New York Times. And Louis, in 1912, got a job as the night editor at the New York Times and said, "Bye, Kentucky, I'm going to New York." And so Louis and his new wife moved to New York and started life there, and the rest of the Hubbard clan sort of follows him in the coming years. So I don't know how many of you knew that Harlan spent some really formative years in New York, but New York and New York City were intensely important to Harlan's development, which sort of isn't something we think of at first when we think of Harlan Hubbard. But New York was really important for a lot of reasons. One of those is a couple years after Louis moves there, Frank moves there. And Frank, Harlan's eldest brother, is really Harlan's best friend. And he remains Harlan's best friend for their entire lives. And part of this is because they shared so much in common. Frank was sort of in the middle of that Hubbard-Swingle continuum, right? So he was still interested in monetary gain, interested in rising in the ranks of, particularly when he moved to New York, the Madison Avenue scene was poppin' for people who wanted to be advertisers or wanted to be illustrators, and he got involved in that. He was a madman, if you've watched that show. So Frank was interested in that, but he was also a very sensitive soul, a very creative soul. And he and Harlan obviously bonded so much over going to museums, going to galleries, going to wonderful concerts, going to parks, taking wonderful hikes along the Palisades in New York. And Frank had also recently married a woman named Frances, Frank and Frances. And so Frank and Frances, she was also an artist, and she was also an avid reader, and she and Frank thought Harlan was just the bee's knees. They thought he was so precocious, he was so intelligent, and so they did everything they could to foster his cultural education while he was there in New York, which of course, New York, there at the turn of the century, was the place to be if you loved art. The world was blowing up because of that newfangled thing called modernism that was coming over from Europe during World War I. But of course, we are in World War I. And so both Frank and Louis already had been married. They had started having children. They were still supporting, effectively, Rose and Harlan. So they had draft exemptions, and they didn't go into the war. Harlan was still too young to be drafted into World War I. And so instead, Harlan decided to enroll in a really cool program that was available to young men who were high achieving in high school in the New York City school system that was called the Farm Cadet Program. And the Farm Cadet Program would send these high achieving young men up to upstate New York to fill in the agricultural sector for the guys who had been sent overseas. And for that sector that was really struggling to produce enough food and to keep going during the war. So Harlan applies for this in 1917 and 1918, and for 2 really formative summers, he spends an entire planting, growing, and harvesting season in upstate New York with these small German immigrant farmers up in upstate New York, learning how to use a scythe properly, learning how to use hand tools, learning how to plant with the seasons, learning things that of course would become very important to the way of life that he would develop later on with Anna at places like Payne Hollow. And one of my favorite artifacts that I uncovered during this whole research process is this essay that you're seeing up here on the screen. This is a culminating essay that every Farm Cadet Program cadet had to write for to get a grade. What's the word I'm looking for? To be. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Yes. So for it to be counted on their academic record that they did this, they had to write this culminating essay. And this is Harlan Hubbard's culminating essay from his experience in upstate New York in 1918. It is the oldest formal composition we have from Harlan Hubbard, which is so cool. To the publication of this, it had never been published. Most people had no idea it existed because it wasn't even listed in the finding aid for the New York State Archives where the Farm Cadet Service program papers are. But I happened to email that archivist and they sent this to me, and it's just a really magical find. This is all printed in full in the book if you're interested in reading the whole thing, but what I want to say about it is that you can already hear some of the poetry of Harlan Hubbard's writing about the seasons, about nature, about agriculture, things that would matter so much to him. And one of the reasons this sounds so good is because you see Henry David Thoreau here glowering at you from the side of the screen. Henry David Thoreau, of course, wrote the transcendentalist masterpiece Walden. Harlan Hubbard wandered into a library in upstate New York near Ithaca one day while he was up there in upstate New York during this program, and pulled that volume off the shelf for the very first time and read it. And Walden and its chorus of simplify, simplify would become the underpinning to almost everything he would do from that point on. So New York was a very formative time for him philosophically. It was an important time for him physically and developmentally when he's thinking about physical labor, which of course is a big part of his experience. It's also an important time for him artistically. When he returns from the Farm Cadet Service in 1918, at the end of 1918, Frank says to him, "Hey, what you gonna do, buddy, once you graduate high school? What you gonna do?" And he says, "Well, I don't know. What do you think I should do?" And of course, Frank loved having this art buddy with him, and he said, "Well, why don't you go to art school?" And Harlan said, "All right, I guess. Yeah, I can try that." So Harlan, with the help of Frank, enrolls in the National Academy of Design in New York. and he does coursework there for on and off 2 to 3 years. Now, the National Academy of Design was a very, very traditional school. There was another important school in New York at that time called the Art Students League that was very connected to modernism, very connected to much more iconoclastic kind of trends in the art world. But the National Academy of Design was very traditional. So Harlan basically spent his first year drawing from plaster casts of, Roman gods for his entire first year. He was very good at doing that because he was a great draftsman. But he supplemented his education with some more exciting things under the tutelage of, again, his brother Frank. This is his very first watercolor that's here on the screen. This is a lovely little painting of a cyclamen in a clay pot that he did actually on his 19th birthday. That was done in 1915 or 1916. This piece is his very first oil painting. That was done on his 19th birthday with under the tutelage of Frank with art supplies that Frank had bought for him. And you may be seeing that it's dated 1921. It wasn't. It was Harlan often didn't sign his paintings, and then when somebody wanted it later on, he would sign it and sort of guesstimate when he did it. But we actually have diary confirmations from his diary and his mother's diary that this was painted on his 19th birthday. So he's exploring in these new media until at the National Academy of Design he finally gets into the life drawing and life painting classes. This is pretty unusual for a Harlan Hubbard painting, right? Those of you who are familiar with his work, he's very much a landscape artist. And if he includes figures, generally figures are pretty small within his works. But you can see what facility he had he wanted to be a figure painter, what facility he had in rendering the human figure. This was painted 1920, 1921, and this was also formative because Harlan was a little bit of a slow starter as a young man, and so this was the first time he had seen a lady with her clothes off, too. So he wrote about that very lovingly in his journal as well. And of course, he's in New York, so he's continuing to study the great artists of the Western and Eastern canons, going to the Metropolitan, going to more avant-garde galleries. His very favorite artist from this period is James Abbott McNeill Whistler. You'd be familiar with Whistler's mother, that painting. Or this is an example of his famous Symphony in White that Harlan is doing a character study of Whistler's Symphony in White. Harlan was also very interested in Whistler's painting technique, which was something called tonalism, which really was very abstracted for the time that it was being painted. Whistler was active in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. He painted this painting all the way here on the far right. This painting is called The Falling Rocket. It caused a huge explosion in the New York art scene when they said, "What is this, Whistler? What are you doing? This is nothing. You're not painting anything." But of course, he was already playing in abstraction by simplifying things, by simplifying shapes, simplifying colors. And Harlan, these two other paintings are done by Harlan in Whistler's style around the period of the 1920s. One great painting that's a little hard to see right now, the very dark one on the left side, that's of people leaving Madison Square Garden, old Madison Square Garden, after the opera by oil lamp. Very atmospheric. And then a beautiful painting of the East River. So Harlan's learning, but not quite landing on a style yet for himself as an artist. And it's around this time, in the mid-1920s, that Rose, you remember that Rose, his mother, sort of was the drill sergeant for the Hubbard family, very interested in, her own life, her own interests, and Harlan was sort of expected to tag along with what Rose wanted to do, especially by the time that his elder brothers had their own families. And so in the mid-1920s, Rose decides she wants to return to Kentucky. She doesn't want to stay in New York anymore. She wants to return to Kentucky. And Harlan writes of this period, he says that it was taken for granted that he would follow her. And I like to do the sort of thought experiment of who Harlan would have been had he not come back to Kentucky. We're very lucky he did. We're very lucky he did. But it's always interesting to think of who the Harlan Hubbard would have been who stayed in New York during the 1920s and maybe became this great abstract expressionist master or something like that. It's really fascinating to think that through. But in any case, they come back in the 1920s, and Harlan is now assumed to be the supporter for his mother. And he would be the supporter for his mother from the mid-1920s until she dies in the mid-1940s. That puts a little bit of a crimp in your style, right, as a young man, trying to find out who you are. Certainly living with your mother is a challenge if you want to be an artist and you're trying to develop this lifestyle, develop this brand. And he wrote of this period, arrived in Kentucky, I was depressed and at loose ends. He really wasn't sure what to do with himself once he came back to Kentucky. And he may have recognized that he was living words from his now favorite book, Walden, The Massive Men Lead Lives of Quiet Desperation. He was really quietly desperate and not sure what the world held for him. But he kept painting. But you can see both of these paintings were done pretty much within a year of each other. You can see how widely he's experimenting with style. Neither of these, if you looked at these, you wouldn't say, yeah, those are both Harlan Hubbards, right? He's experimenting very wildly with all kinds of techniques, from realism to a very obvious look at Impressionism, and very much like Monet. So he's playing with all these styles, trying to find his artistic identity, but he also knows because he doesn't have an artistic identity, he doesn't really have the chops to support himself and his mother as an artist. And so he starts working construction. And Harlan Hubbard, it's really interesting to trace through Rose's diaries, which are at the Behringer-Crawford Museum and are fabulous. They're actually dry as toast, but they record pretty much daily information about where Rose and Harlan were every single day from like 1909 until the 1940s, which is incredible. So again, dry as toast, but really interesting for biographers because I knew what Harlan was doing all the time. But going through those journals and going through Harlan's journals, which he would start in the 1920s, you can see he's got his hands in all kinds of projects all over Newport, Covington, Fort Thomas. He's working in projects all over the place as a contractor and as a builder. And he's learning really important skills in masonry. He's learning bricklaying. He's learning, basic framing. He's learning basic electricity and plumbing, things that, are going to come into play later on in his life as skills that he has been trained to do and can translate into his own vision for architectural structures. And in 1923, I mentioned we were going to talk about Fort Thomas. 1923, he says to his mom, they've been living in just sort of random apartments in Fort Thomas and Newport. And he said, Mom, why don't, I've had a couple years under my belt of doing construction work. Why don't you let me build us a house? And so he builds them this beautiful house at 129 Highland Avenue in Fort Thomas. That is still standing. Still looks almost exactly like that. You can see that when you go see the Fort Thomas Forest Conservancy open studio days to see the studio, which we'll talk about in a second. But this house he built for himself and his mother, and he and his mother lived there until she died. This home, you can see this also great picture of Harlan there, with his little trowel. Harlan is making it work, but he has to support his mom. And in this period, they sort of bond a little bit, what little they can, through a shared love of traveling. And they actually have an occasion to travel because we haven't talked about Louis for a while. Louis, the middle brother, was working at the New York Times, and in the early 1920s he said, I'm tired of newspaper work. I'm going to try my hand at this newfangled thing called motion pictures. And so he said, I'm going to start writing scripts for some of the local houses that were there in New York. He had some success with places like Pathé and smaller houses in New York. And then, of course, if you want to hack it in Hollywood, you got to go to Hollywood. So Louis moves his family out to Hollywood and has really great success during the silent era of films. Just an example, the first time Louis invites Rose and Harlan to come visit him in Beverly Hills, that's Louis and their mother, Rose, standing in front of his mansion in Beverly Hills. I say mansion because he was doing real well, because in 1926, he was actually on location and asked Harlan and Rose to come care for his children and his wife while he was on location in San Antonio filming a movie called Wings. Wings, which came out in 1927, was the very first Academy Award winner for Best Picture. And Louis was the executive producer on that. So Louis was doing great. Louis was doing great. Rose loved Hollywood. She thought Hollywood was great because, of course, she could meet Gary Cooper, and she could meet Charlie Chaplin, and she could go to the studio parties, and she could hobnob with all of these incredible producers. As you might expect, Harlan hated Hollywood. He thought it was pretentious. He thought it was, just terrible. And so while Rose is going out to these glittering parties with Louis and his family, Harlan is generally escaping out into the desert landscapes to camp out in the desert, rough in a little pup tent, and takes this watercolor set and paints these beautiful, strange western landscapes that are so different than back at home in Kentucky. This is a really wonderful watercolor of his from that era that's just wonderful. So, even though Harlan didn't want the kind of success that Louis had, this glittering Hollywood kind of life, he did want to be successful. It wasn't true that Harlan Hubbard wasn't ambitious. He was ambitious, but he wanted to be ambitious on his terms, and he wanted to be ambitious with his interests. And so when they returned to Kentucky in late 1927, after spending an extended period of time in California, he decides, I need to figure out what my style is. And the way I'm going to do that is not by painting in my tiny little second floor bedroom in the house that I share with my mother. The way I'm going to find my artistic voice is getting out where I can be inspired by the spirit of place, because he knew he wanted to be a landscape painter. He knew that he loved the northern Kentucky landscape. And so this is the period when he establishes a couple of studios out in what was then really very much wilderness and farmland of the northern Kentucky landscape above what's now the Mary Draper Ingalls Highway, the River Road. The first studio he built for himself out there was above a little place called Brent. Brent doesn't exist anymore, but those of you who have read Shanty Boat will know the name Brent, because that's eventually where he would build his shanty boat with Anna, which we'll talk about in just a second. But at Brent, there was an active shanty boat community already. At a time when shanty boat communities were really dying out along the Ohio River. And Harlan would spend lots of time getting to know these sort of characters who were living down there on the riverbank, sort of glorying in that experience, and then wandering through those beautiful winding roads and hills up toward Cold Spring, and Winter's Lane is the place where he had his first studio out there. And he loved just going out into the wilderness and getting lost and experiencing this place that he loved. But he still wasn't having much success. He still was working in construction, and it wasn't until, ironically, the Great Depression that he started to see some success as an artist. And that was because in the 1930s, you will have heard of the WPA. There was a pilot program before the WPA called the PWAP. And the PWAP, the Public Works of Art Project, was a pilot program for the federal government to see what it would look like to be commissioning artists from around the country to paint local public art within their communities, or to sculpt local public art in their communities. certainly that would translate into what the WPA would become. Harlan Hubbard was approached by the chairman for Northern Kentucky, who knew his artwork, and he wanted to commission him to do some pieces for Northern Kentucky as part of the PWAP program. This was Harlan Hubbard's first commission. It was 1934, so Harlan Hubbard was 34 when he got his first artistic commission. Okay, so he gets this commission, but the brief for the PWAP is called the American Scene. And you guys will be familiar with American scene painting because it later would become something called regionalism. Regionalism, typified by people like Grant Wood, so think of American Gothic. Think of Thomas Hart Benton. This is a Thomas Hart Benton here on the screen. One of the most famous practitioners of the American scene style. Very, very figure-driven. Very, very history-driven. Very narrative-driven. All things that Harlan was not interested in at all. And so he said to his regional chairman, please let me paint a steamboat mural or something. Let me do something, about the river or the landscape. And he said, no, stick to the brief. So we got 4 paintings and 1 mural from Harlan from this commission. Those of you who have been to the Carnegie Library, the Carnegie in Covington, and have been in their auditorium for a show, will have seen this proscenium mural that is there. This was and is the largest Harlan Hubbard painted to date. So this was a challenging piece for him just in terms of scale, but it was also really a challenge for him in terms of subject matter because he had to be painting figures, he had to be painting figures from history, and these figures, are sort of telling these large, the big myths about the founding of Kentucky. And this piece is called The Spirit of Covington, for that large golden woman there floating in the center, the benevolent spirit of the city of Covington. And we have Mary Draper Ingalls there, we have Daniel Boone, we have John G. Carlyle, and we have Simon Kenton. So, these big names of white history of Kentucky that he's painting to follow this brief. This painting, Harlan Hubbard, you can see it's adept, it's well done, it's colorful, still looks great, it's been restored and it looks great in the space. But Harlan was very ambivalent about this piece. He ultimately said that, I'm paraphrasing, but it would not bring him great distress if the whole building collapsed into rubble. So ambivalent is one word you could use for it. But he did make over $650 in 1934 for these commissions, which was amazing for a first commission. Also during the Great Depression, in a time when many people were struggling to make ends meet. Here he is making a big commission from the federal government for his painting, and it got his name out there. And so in 1935 and 1936, he actually had his first solo exhibitions in Cincinnati at the Getz Brown Gallery over in Cincinnati. And so this style of painting that he didn't exactly love kickstarted his career, and he was really able to start painting and selling his paintings. But by this time, we're looking at 1937, 1938 now. Rose is starting to go downhill physically. Her health is not good. She's also starting to slide into dementia problems. And Harlan having these studios out in the wilderness, 16, 17 miles away from their home in Fort Thomas, wasn't going to work for her anymore because she needed him to be home in case she had a health emergency. And so she said, Harlan, can't you find a studio closer to home? He took that very literally. This is literally built in the backyard of that house I showed you that he built in 1923. But if you're looking at this, and who's been to see this structure before, the Fort Thomas studio? Okay. So if you're looking at this for the first time, aren't you getting glimmers of Payne Hollow? If you've seen pictures of Payne Hollow with that huge, beautiful window in the front letting that natural light in for painting, building directly into the hillside, which is something he learned from the German vernacular architecture all around northern Kentucky. Building directly into the hillside using recycled materials. All of these materials were recycled or, in some way retrieved by non-traditional methods. There's even a little turtle shell up in the top of the design on the front of this building. So he's really starting to play with these aesthetic ideas and really starting to hone not only in his painting but also in his structure building this voice that we would see very, very strongly once he gets to Payne Hollow. And so by this point, Rose is really not doing well, but he has committed to care for her until she dies. But during this time, he also meets this striking, blonde, intelligent, musical woman named Anna Wonder Eichenhout, who is a librarian at the Fine Arts Library over in Cincinnati. And he's there at the library all the time, checking out books, doing research. They bond very politely over their shared interests in poetry and in art and in music. And when she finds out that Harlan, who played both the violin and the viola, not terribly well, but played them, and had a real passion for them, when she found out that he played, she said, I am a trained pianist and I play the cello. We should play music together sometime. And they would play music together. Their first unofficial date, he went over to her apartment and they played this beautiful César Franck piano sonata together that's very romantic. I love listening to it, just thinking about that first meeting. But they ultimately began a courtship. Now, you can imagine, Rose was very jealous of her time with Harlan. She was also in this very challenging time where her mental capacity is already slipping. And so she was a little cruel toward Anna during this period. She didn't love the fact that Harlan was being taken away from her by this woman, even though he had given her so many years of his life. But Anna and Harlan persist. They end up eloping to Maysville, Kentucky. On April 20th, 1943, and get married. And they decide that while Rose is still alive, they don't want to live in the house with Rose. They end up living in this little building, the little studio. This is a very small building, by the way. So they're already practicing this idea that both of them loved, from Thoreau, from the Transcendentalists, from all kinds of important ways to simplify your life, to divest from conspicuous consumerism, to divest from the modern world in as many ways as possible, and to subsist with what you can grow, with what you can barter, with what you can borrow. And they begin doing that here in the Fort Thomas studio. This Fort Thomas studio was not much larger than the next structure that Harlan would build. And that next structure is, of course, the shanty boat. Harlan, as you saw from the very beginning, had grown up along the Ohio River, and back in the very early years of his life, he would have been very familiar with the shanty boat communities that were still thriving along the Ohio River. This is a really great illustration by another artist named Glenn Tracy of that settlement at Brent, where Harlan had his studio in the 1920s. This community, Harlan haunted that community all the time. He already had friends there, and he had sort of developed this desire that he eventually shared with Anna, that he would love to build a shanty boat one day. And Anna said, okay. Rose, Harlan's mother, passes away in November of 1943, and it's Anna who says, now is the time that we are going to do this thing that you have long dreamed of. We're going to move to the riverbank and build a shanty boat. So this is a really remarkable chapter that has been very well documented in Harlan's own writing. So I would really encourage you to, if you haven't read Shanty Boat for a long time, or you've never read Shanty Boat, picking up Shanty Boat and reading about this incredible experience that they had building this beautiful boat. existing at this community. They lived at the community at Brent for 2 years before they ever started drifting down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, because they loved what they were learning from these people. They loved this sense of independence and strength that they saw in this much and little lifestyle that river folk were living. Ultimately, as you will know, they spent the next 7 years after their 2 years at Brent drifting slowly down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers in this boat that had no motor, so they would only travel by the movement of the river and knowledge of that river. It was an incredible existence that, high water season, spring, winter, spring, is when you could really get where you wanted to go because the water was moving fast. And summer, you would tie up, you would plant a garden, you would wait for that garden to grow, you would harvest, and then you would can all of these things that you had harvested, and you had this wonderful preserved sustenance for your next winter and spring of drifting. It was a wonderful cycle and sequence that was completely dedicated to the patterns of the river and the patterns of the weather. They reach New Orleans in 1951. They take a little tour through the Intracoastal Waterway for a few months, but they're starting to feel it's their 9th wedding anniversary by the time they're down there in New Orleans. The first 9 years of their marriage are either spent living in the tiny Fort Thomas studio in a shanty boat in a pup tent on the shore, or just these really non-traditional, sort of rootless existences, and they find themselves really wanting to put down roots somewhere. And so they end up selling the shanty boat down in the bayous. Harlan and Anna take on 2 big projects at this point. The first one is, of course, I've already mentioned, Harlan's breakout book was Shanty Boat. That was published in 1953, so not long after they returned from this great shanty boat journey. And through this whole journey, he had been thinking about how he could turn this into a really great book. And his brother Frank, still working in New York, had lots of connections in the publishing industry because of his work in illustration. He helped Harlan get a book deal at a major New York publisher for Shanty Boat. And Harlan did, of course, all of the illustrations. You see him very awkwardly pointing to some photographs and pen and ink illustrations that he did for Shanty Boat. He also did that beautiful cover, dust cover. That's very rare if you ever find one of those at auction that's still in good shape. Finding that cover that Harlan also designed and painted himself is really incredible. So they're working on this project, but they're also trying to figure out where they want to put down those roots. And they keep coming back to this place where they had spent their very first shanty boat summer. And those shanty boat summers are those times I was describing to you when they would tie up and plant a garden. And their very first shanty boat summer in 1947, they tied up a couple miles downriver from Madison, Indiana, and Milton, Kentucky, a little place called Payne's Landing. And Payne's Landing, which they ultimately would call Payne Hollow, became their forever home. After that, they fell in love with it in 1947, returned to it in 1953, and spent the rest of their lives there, building this incredible existence that was so informed by what they had learned in their shanty boat years of subsistence, of much and little of self-sufficiency, of living with the seasons. Their original cabin was not much larger than their shanty boat. You're looking at the original cabin there. Those of you who have been to Payne Hollow, that's the back room of Payne Hollow as it stands now. They ultimately, a few years later, built a huge addition on the front, huge in relative terms. A larger addition because Anna wanted to have, for example, her baby grand piano down there in the hollow. They needed more room to entertain. They needed more room to cook. And so what started as this tiny little cabin ultimately developed into this much larger structure, and also sort of a campus of structures. Harlan ultimately built himself a studio and a workshop, that was there. That's still standing. That also had a privy. They kept goats, so they had a really wonderful goat house, and they kept goats for about 10 years. And they would use every part of the goat, every bit of the goat. So not only using the milk to make cheese and have milk, but also slaughtering the goats and using goat in their cooking. They also used, Anna became deeply prolific at making really tasty dishes with things like groundhog, things that were coming to them naturally through their surroundings. Their dogs were trained to catch groundhog from eating all of their vegetables that they were growing at Payne Hollow. And the groundhog would be repurposed into amazing stews. Now, I've never eaten a groundhog stew. I don't know. Has anybody here had groundhog? Okay. Oh, you've had groundhog. Is it good?
Greasy.
Greasy. Yeah, okay. So a little gamey. Anna was a whiz, though, and her incredible creativity, she always said that she wasn't the creative one, that Harlan was the creative one, that he was the writer and the artist. None of it would have been possible without Anna making their actual life beautiful, making their actual life work, serving groundhog on her blue and white china with their Dutch brass service. Just an incredible example of how these two people had come together and created what seems an inconceivable life to many people for certain reasons, like living off the grid with no electricity, no running water in a traditional sense. Those of you who have been to Payne Hollow know that there's about a 500-foot elevation change from the uplands of Bedford and Milton, Kentucky, down to the riverbank. So it is a rough hike. So if you're wanting to get anything into the hollow, better bring it by water from the Indiana side, or you're going to be hauling it in by one of the roughest trails that you can imagine. Beautiful, but rough. So isolated. And even though they had many, many visitors, both by water and by trail, from nearby Hanover College, ultimately, when Harlan in the 1970s publishes a book about their self-sufficient lifestyle at Payne Hollow, they start getting journalists and all kinds of travelers from farther flung places, even farther flung as Europe, and places not in the United States, not regional, who are fascinated by this life that they've built that's not only self-sufficient, but not self-sufficient in that sort of Unabomber freaky way. Self-sufficient in an incredibly beautiful, incredibly harmonious, and incredibly covetable way, that when you go, you feel like time stops in Payne Hollow. And that's because of this just legacy that they've left behind of this beautiful life where they were living perhaps lives they never thought they were going to get to live, of such beauty, of such purpose. So this life in Payne Hollow, filled with music, filled with art. Harlan is continuing to paint. This is an image of a painting that he did of his studio, and then this is a photograph of the interior of his studio. Very simple, not pretentious. He's also coming into his own as a painter at this point. These are from a series that he did of 5 huge paintings for a bank in Owensboro that he was commissioned for in the 1960s, that tells the story of Owensboro and the river from the flatboat days all the way up to the days you see cars and barges in this bottom painting. Tells the story of Owensboro in these 5 paintings. These are huge, 5x8 paintings. They're now in the Owensboro Museum of Fine Art, if you ever make it down there to check those out. But he's developed this incredibly recognizable style now. This doesn't look like somebody else's work. This looks like Harlan Hubbard's work. So this is when he's coming into his own artistically. All of this is happening at this beautiful place where they lived all the way up into their 80s. Imagine the fortitude, the strength, the will to exist in a rough place like this, however beautiful, into your 80s. The kind of Herculean effort it was just to chop enough wood to keep warm and cook at a place like Payne Hollow is just astounding to think about. but they were fortunate enough to live there at this place into their 80s until they became too infirm to live there. And really, they only spent small spurts of time in hospitals and in friends' homes in Madison during their final illnesses. I mentioned that Anna died in 1986, Harlan died in 1988, so they were there from 1953 until basically a year before each of them passed away. And in fact, they're still there. This image that you're looking at here on the right, that's their headstone. They were cremated and buried at Payne Hollow, and they still are there at Payne Hollow in this beautiful place, this wonderful, harmonious life that they built there in this beautiful place along the river. I told you I was going to come back to this painting at the end. And so where that yellow circle is, remember I felt drawn into this painting, even though I didn't know the story of the Hubbards. I didn't know why I was being drawn, other than it's just a well-done painting with, you know, nice vertical perspective. But where that circle is, that's where Payne Hollow is, in the center of that view, in the center of that painting. That's exactly where they would settle and build this incredible life that became the pinnacle of their legacy and of their story. I was being drawn to that place that was so important to them, so central to them, but also ultimately became so central to me and so central to my career and to my life and the way that I've chosen, now to live my own life in their honor. So yeah, this painting still get little chill bumps every once in a while when I think about staring at that. So I'm so appreciative to you all for your time. Like I said, I probably skipped over big parts of things that you wanted to know more about. I'm going to be back there. You can ask me questions. I'll ask a few questions now if you, we probably can't take too many. I don't want to go over time. But I also would encourage you to read not only my book, but also read Wendell Berry's wonderful biography of Harlan Hubbard, which came out in the 80s, right after Harlan died. That's a beautiful lyrical book that is, of course, by one of the great writers of Kentucky, and also, of course, Harlan Hubbard's writings as well. Please be sure to check those out if you have the chance. This QR code takes you to my website that gives you all the information on other talks I'm giving, on the exhibits and where they'll be, if you want to go see things, and then other resources related to the Hubbards, including information about that nonprofit organization that a couple of years ago bought the Payne Hollow property and is currently restoring the property, doing scientific research on the land. I'm working with the artifacts collection of the many, many archival materials and objects that were still there from the Hubbards that are now being preserved for future generations. So you can learn more about Payne Hollow in the Ohio as well. So thank you all so much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take a few questions. Thank you. Does anybody have? Yeah.
I don't have a